This is Nightmare Reaper, an FPS currently in early access that just got very recently an update adding the second of its 3 episodes. So it's got quite a bit of its content now, and I thought that it might be a good time to take a look at it. It's going for the sort of hybrid old school, new school FPS, where on first glance it looks like a very old school FPS just by looking at it. You know, it's got all the chunky pixels, it's got your character's portrait in the bottom corner there, it's got sprite-based enemies. But when you start to look a little bit closer, you see that it's also got some newer school ideas, like a huge variety of weapons with a color-coded rarity system like an action RPG, a currency system including a skill tree for upgrades, and you'll also notice that those sprite-based enemies aren't exactly sprite-based in the most technical sense and actually have a kind of a neat feature of being technically 3D modeled while looking like sprites. At least that's how I would presume it's done, because although they do have that 2D sprite-based appearance, they are actually 3D and they can be taken apart, bisected, decapitated, stuff like that, and torn to pieces by explosions, and you can even turn them around to see their back or go to their side to see that they almost disappear because they're so thin, because they're sort of 2D but not exactly, and they sort of flap around like cardboard if you kill them in certain ways and stuff. It's actually really cute, and it shows that there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye at first. It kind of reminds me of Project Warlock, another one of these sort of old school FPS, but using a lot of new school ideas that I covered not too long ago. So, the first thing to talk about is obviously how it looks. I did mention it's got those sprite-based enemies, kind of, that actually have some 3D modeling going on, but there's also quite a lot of detail in the environments, with each different tile set of environments having its own theme, its own clutter objects, which tend to be destructible, and also its own overall environment art and assets being different for each sort of set of levels. The levels go by tile sets in 3s, so you will do 3 levels, each with a specific name, and then move on to a different set of 3 levels, each with, you know, their own tile sets and their own new enemy types being introduced and all that sort of thing, giving it that sort of episodic feel that you're probably familiar with for a lot of these older school shooters, especially build engine stuff. It's very much billed as something kind of like that, and the description on the store page even name drops stuff like Blood, Duke 3D, all that sort of stuff that you'd pretty much expect to be a pretty obvious influence on this game's overall design. But there's also a lot of extra visual effects, some extra flair going on. You see like the sort of 2D looking particle effects for Blood, which are really satisfying, and you've also of course got all those like screen effects, like your blurs and lights. You've got a lot of glow, very fancy looking glow effects and lighting effects, casting really nice shadows which help to add to the atmosphere a lot, so it looks actually quite good. It definitely doesn't look like a game in the build engine at the time could have. It uses a similar sort of chunky style, but of course with a lot more fancy lighting and shadow effects than you might be used to in a game like that, and I actually enjoy that art style, the sort of mix of old and new with like old textures but new effects. I think tends to look quite nice. Story-wise, it's actually pretty neat. It's got one of those stories that's deliberately non-confrontational, as in you don't have to engage with the story if you don't want to, but it is there if you choose to actually try and go into detail with it. You can just go from level to level if you wish and not really pay any attention to the story, but there is a whole sort of side thing going on with your character actually being in what appears to be like an asylum or hospital of some kind, and it looks sort of abandoned-ish, having these notes that appear that tell the story little by little as you complete each level, adding more and more notes and fleshing out more of this character's backstory, and you start to kind of understand that the stuff that you're doing, the enemies that you're fighting and the things that you're seeing may or may not actually be real, and your character may or may not actually have some sort of very traumatic past that's causing all of this to appear, and she might be kind of crazy, sort of. And it's actually a pretty neat story because there's a lot to it, actually, but like I said, it's also very non-intrusive. You don't have to pay attention to it if you don't want to. You don't have to read those notes. You don't have to explore the hospital, but you actually can. In between the main levels, as you complete the episodes and the chapters, the hospital itself, or whatever it is, will open up and allow you to get to more and more creepy things will start happening there, with all sorts of horrible sounds and weird atmospheric things going on and some sort of shadows that you see. It's actually really neat, and I think it's an interesting way to do a story in a game like this, because by default, a lot of people don't really expect a story in an old school shooter because it's not really necessary. You know, it's about the shooting. It's not really about the backstory of the character or anything. But if you are going to give a backstory to the character, doing it in a way that is sort of voluntary for you to explore if you want to, and there actually being some pretty neat stuff for you to find and assume as you go through, is a good way to do it, I feel. But, of course, beyond all that, the actual meat of the game is its combat, and that is definitely where the game shines the most. The combat is extremely satisfying, and the weapon variety is one of the best aspects of the game. There are currently like 58 weapons in the early access, and they're planned to be about 80 or so by the release, so there's a lot of weapons, and they all have a primary and secondary fire, so that's also nice. The secondary fires range from pretty simple stuff like, iron sights or a scope, to more complicated things like charge attacks, to really exotic stuff like altering fire modes or some other sort of magic-based things. There are a lot of different weapon types. You have your sort of traditional FPS arsenal like pistols, shotguns, rifles, some sniper stuff, to, like repeating weapons of various kinds, some of which are really satisfying because they really take enemies apart in a nice sort of impactful way. It's very messy. And other magic stuff like you're seeing right now, spell books that cast all sorts of different spells on primary and secondary fire, staves that can cast spells, and some more exotic weapons like various multi-mode grenade launchers, mini nuke launchers, handheld howitzers, and one of my personal favorites, the grenade harpoon gun that is an illegal amount of fun to use because it just pins enemies to walls from far away and then explodes. So you can actually use it for like high single target damage and AoE damage. It only has like 3 rounds per magazine. A lot of the weapons do require a reload, so that's a little bit unusual for some old school FPS, but not every weapon needs reloaded. Obviously things like the magic weapons and a lot of the energy weapons like the plasma rifle and stuff don't necessarily reload as much. But yeah, that grenade harpoon gun is one of the best things in an FPS, I think, and I think every game needs something like that, some sort of thing that allows you to impale people to walls like the stake launcher and painkiller, but also blows them up afterwards. It is just way too much fun to use. And even strange swarm missile launchers like you're seeing right now, able to even destroy some of the more hard to destroy scenery items like big trees and stuff. So yeah, there's a huge arsenal in this game, and so far they have all been worth using, very satisfying to use. And there are also power-ups, as you're seeing. The power-ups are a lot more rare. They are things that you don't come across that often and don't last very long, but they are very powerful. Power-ups include things like this, the titular Nightmare Reaper, that gives you, basically it makes you into like an avatar of death, and you throw like infinite explosive magic orbs and also have a big piercing beam that you fire. There's the V power-up, which tints the screen green and is basically like bullet time for everyone but you, so everything else moves very slow, including your own bullets, but you still move very quick. There is another power-up that's basically a monster energy drink, I'm pretty sure, that makes everything you do super fast, so your fire rate, your reload speeds, your walk speed and all that gets like drastically increased for a minute. And then there's the reflection power-up, which basically mirrors you bilaterally, so whatever you're holding, you're now holding 2 of, and to predictably ridiculous results, to like being able to cast huge spells all over the screen, or like storm the area with twice as many missiles as normal and all that sort of thing. So yeah, the power-ups make a huge difference in the combat, which is probably why they're so rare. They actually kind of remind me of like the modern Doom and Doom Eternal power-ups, in that they tend to be ridiculously powerful, but you don't see them all the time. When you do see them in an arena though, you immediately go for them because you know how much of a difference they'll make. I did mention there is a rarity system in the game, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing for a minute, because rarity kind of has a set meaning in a game like this, as in like an action RPG rarity system, like color-coded, uncommon, rare, epic, legendary, that sort of thing. And this game does have that. Weapons have colors, and you may come across a standard 6-shooter and a blue 6-shooter, which is the rarity, and it will have extra stats, like an extra fire rate. I once came across an AK-47 that had explosive ammo, which was hilarious for the entire level, and some other stuff like that. So yeah, weapons can have all sorts of extra effects depending on their rarity, and if you are able to find one of those orange or gold legendary rarity weapons, you definitely want to hang on to it and use it, because it tends to have all sorts of silly stuff, like drastically increasing its magazine sizes, giving it the ability to like shock entire rooms of enemies, or even leech health as you kill enemies to help you restore your own health, that sort of thing. So they tend to be quite powerful. But there is also a level system, and this isn't like leveling up, getting experience kind of level. This is sort of like the more traditional version of rarity, as in how rare it is that you will find it. Not action RPG rarity color-coded, but like how scarce is this to actually find. And higher level weapons seem to be the more exotic, more powerful things that drop less frequently. So level 1 weapons are your traditional FPS arsenal, your pistols, your shotguns, that sort of thing. But if you want, say, like a repeating shotgun, that might be like a level 2 weapon, or you might find like a railgun that can pierce entire rooms full of enemies, which is a level 3 weapon. That idea seems to be actual like scarcity rarity, not action RPG rarity, which is what I initially meant by it's kind of confusing to explain at first, but once you start playing, it's not that confusing. And the level of a weapon is actually important, because once you complete a stage, you get to choose one level 1 weapon to keep. You can hold as many weapons as you can come across. You can hold dozens of them. Although you do have a limited number of weapon slots, you can go to the pause menu at any time and drag all of the weapons that you have picked up so far into those slots. So you can, you technically can carry as many as you want. You can only quick switch to a certain number, and you can upgrade the number of total slots that you have. You start with 2, but you can quickly get 4 or 5 as you go through the skill tree, which I'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, when you complete a mission, you get to keep one level 1 weapon, and all of the other weapons have a value and they'll be sold. This is to help you get more gold for the skill tree, and that level 1 weapon that you keep, you will have the next time you start the next mission, and you keep this even through deaths. This game is not a roguelite. You don't restart when you die. You only have to restart the level that you died on. You don't lose progress or have to go through a whole set of levels again or anything like that. So if you're at like Immemorial Woods 2 and you die, then you'll restart right there, and then eventually go to 3 and then the next set. When you do die, you lose all the weapons that you picked up except for the one that you chose to keep from the previous level, and you get to keep all the gold that you obtain to help you sort of slowly get towards some more upgrades even when dying, which is a nice feature, honestly. Although with enough investment in the skill tree, you can actually eventually choose to keep a level 2 weapon instead to sort of upgrade your chances as the levels get harder. So what about the full skill tree? Well, you'll notice the pause menu of the game is actually what appears to be a Game Boy Advance SP, which is very cute, and the skill tree itself is actually a cartridge that you find in after the tutorial that you put into the back of it and enables the use of the skill tree, and it's basically a Super Mario World. The skill tree has multiple worlds that you go through in a sort of 2D side-scroller based thing, and as you select the node that you want to upgrade, you pay the gold cost, and then you do a quick mini game of like 3 or 4 screens of like a Super Mario-esque side scroller that'll have coins and treasures to collect, which help you make back some of the money that you spent on actually upgrading. And you'll just have to platform around these screens until you get to the blue door at the end, and once you do that, you will unlock the upgrade for your character permanently. This is optional. If you don't like the idea of having to do a minigame every time you want to upgrade one of your skills, you can just turn it off and have it work basically just like a more traditional standard skill tree, just with a fancier menu, if you want to do it that way. You will miss out on the extra gold that you can get in the actual levels themselves if you do that, but still, if you don't want to do the minigame, then you don't have to, which I think is cool. I like it, but I like that it's optional as well. I think it's a good idea to have something that's kind of silly like that to be optional, just in case it kind of rubs people the wrong way, but I think there's enough effort put into it to justify doing it, because you won't be repeating the same like 2 or 3 levels every time. Every one is different. They are their own like side-scrolling levels, properly created and everything. There are enemies in each one, and as you go through the worlds, you will get more power-ups and more enemy varieties and everything in exactly the type that you would expect for a side-scroller. So even though it's like a small, tiny little minigame, enough effort and care has been put into it to show enough dedication to make it worth doing, because it's cute and it's fun, and I like the idea of having this sort of silly minigame for upgrading your character. Another thing of note, by the way, is the soundtrack. The soundtrack to this game is wonderful. It is made by the excellent Andrew Hulshult, the guy that did the soundtrack for games like Dusk, Medieval, the expansion stuff for Doom Eternal. He definitely knows what he's doing when it comes to game soundtracks, and it shows in this game as well. He's got that really nice sort of like almost grungy, quakey metal sort of going on when it comes to the actual combat environments, and then that creepy ambience to really crank up the atmosphere in between combats when you're just exploring. Really, the game overall just has a generally interesting atmosphere. It's kind of fascinating. It's definitely a sort of uncomfortable and weird, but in a way that I appreciate. It has like that old school, dark, grungy atmosphere, but also some other elements, some more psychological elements. It's not overtly a horror game, but it definitely has uncomfortable atmosphere and like a horror environment. I think because of that, the main story being, involving like a psychological aspect with the main character being in what appears to be some sort of like asylum or something like that. So there's nothing that's like overtly a horror game about it, but the atmosphere itself is definitely weird, kind of cult-ish, and really off-putting in a lot of ways that I think it's supposed to be. It's supposed to feel weird and creepy, not in a way that is objectively terrifying, but in a way that is just odd. And I think it pulls that off really well. And the music and overall sound design is a good portion of this, because there's some weird noises, some creepy ambience, really good atmosphere building stuff going on that helps in between the actual, blood pumping big combat arenas and everything, which are also satisfying in their own way. So it does pull this sort of two worlds thing off of being a combination of like old school shooter action and a bit more cerebral, a bit more creepy, a bit more atmospheric in between. I think it's a stellar shooter, really. It shows that a lot of work and care has been put into pretty much every aspect of it, from even like the silliest seeming mechanics, like the upgrade minigames, to the enemy variety increasing as you go through the levels, the really fantastic selection of weapons, and the sort of rarity effects that weapons can have, making the combat super satisfying. I can't really explain just how satisfying it is to take the enemies apart in this game because the weapons are so fun to use and there are so many of them to discover. And it honestly kind of reminds me of playing one of those like larger, complex, sort of kitchen sinky Doom mods like Oblige or Eons of Death, that kind of thing. And it overall stands at this really nice precipice between old school classic shooter, secret hunting action, and new school glowy action RPG systems kind of stuff, all mixed together in a way that actually works quite well and gels nicely with each other. And there are even all sorts of fun extra random events that can happen after you clear out a room. Everything from like extra encounters spawning with very odd rules to NPCs that allow you to shop in certain ways, or even a dog that you can give bones to. He'll give you treasures afterwards and you can even pet him and stuff, which is adorable. Yeah, I'm definitely excited to see where it goes from here. The second chapter big update, or second episode update, has added even more to the variety. So obviously seeing the final weapon variety and level varieties finish as the third episode gets added later will be pretty cool to see everything come together like that. And I think overall it makes for a really, really nice old school shooter experience with some newer school elements, some nice effects, and some kind of interesting story bits that I'm kind of excited to see what exactly they're going to do with it, like what the payoff is going to be as you get towards the end of the final episode. But overall, it is a very solid shooter that is absolutely worth checking out. The link will be in the description below this video to the early access campaign page if you want to look at it over on Steam, or wishlist it to watch the updates roll in over time, that sort of thing. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys next time.